Malcolm Bennett was 44 years old, and for 12 years he poured every dollar, every spare hour, and more sleepless nights than he could count into a company his wife liked to dismiss as his little hobby. While Malcolm made cold calls late at night from a spare bedroom, Celeste managed the household finances and quietly decided he was not worth the risk. She had the divorce papers prepared before she ever told him she was leaving. She took the house, the savings, and 2 years of financial support. She left him the company in writing, on the record, calling it a liability she wanted nothing to do with. 3 years later, Malcolm closed a $300 million federal contract. Within weeks, his former wife walked into the lobby of his headquarters with an attorney beside her and a legal motion in hand. She looked Malcolm directly in the eye and told him she was entitled to her share of everything they had built together. She said it as if the claim were completely reasonable, as if she had not signed her own name to a document walking away from the business. She looked at Malcolm as though he was still the same man she had left behind. She had no idea who was standing in front of her now. Before we get into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from and subscribe, because the next story is one you won't want to miss. Malcolm saw his name on the building every morning when he entered the parking deck. 14 floors of glass and steel rose above Peachtree Street, and near the top, in letters almost 2 feet tall, were the words Bennett Supply Group, Supply. He did not look at them with loud pride. It felt more like quiet confirmation, as though he were checking a fact that still seemed too large to accept without verification. Inside his corner office, the Atlanta skyline spread across the floor to ceiling windows behind him. Morning sunlight cut across his desk and illuminated the stack of documents Tessa Monroe had placed in front of him. Tessa always worked the same way, quietly, precisely, without needing to be reminded twice. "Last quarter's numbers first," she said as she sat across from him. Tessa was 38, sharp-eyed, observant, and gifted with the ability to say exactly as much as necessary and nothing more. She opened her binder. Revenue is up 19% from the same quarter last year. Charlotte posted its strongest month since we opened that office. Houston is close behind. Malcolm nodded and turned to the page she indicated. 340 employees now worked across 3 cities. There were offices filled with furniture he had personally chosen and a logistics operation moving products for pharmaceutical distributors, government agencies, and mid-sized manufacturers across 11 states. He remembered where it had started. A spare bedroom in a rented house in East Point. A used laptop he bought from a student at night school for $80. A legal pad filled with cold call numbers copied from industry directories at the public library. Back then, Malcolm worked a full day at a freight brokerage, came home, ate whatever was fast, and disappeared into that spare room. He dialed number after number, deep into the night, sometimes until the rest of the neighborhood seemed completely asleep. The carpet in that room had been the color of old mustard and carried a faint smell he never managed to identify. Malcolm spent hundreds of hours there without anyone promising him that any of it would work. His grandfather had poured concrete for 40 years. His father had spent 30 of his strongest years on his knees inside other people's buildings, installing heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, then coming home with grease on his forearms and a quiet dignity Malcolm did not fully understand until much later. Neither man had ever worked inside a building with his own name on it. Malcolm thought about that more often than he admitted. "And then there's this," Tessa said. She pushed a thick packet toward him. It was tabbed, highlighted, and marked with the federal seal. The $300 million contract, 5 years renewable. A logistics management agreement with the federal government that Bennett Supply Group had spent 14 months competing to win. The contract had only recently become public. A local business publication had run a story about it, and a national trade outlet picked it up soon afterward. "The performance benchmarks are aggressive," Tessa said, "but we're already built for them. I don't see a quarter where we're not ahead of projection." She paused. Then the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "Your little hobby did all right." Malcolm looked up. Tessa said it without cruelty and without apology. She had heard him use that phrase once, months after she joined the company, when he gave her the short version of the divorce. She had never repeated it until now. The words landed differently in her voice. Flat, factual, almost like a verdict. Something shifted inside Malcolm's chest. A small release of pressure he had not realized he was still carrying. "Yeah," he said, "it did." He turned back to the contract and initialed the places Tessa had marked. He handled each page carefully, the way he always handled documents that mattered. He never rushed for the sake of looking efficient. He simply did the work correctly, because doing it correctly was the only method he had ever trusted. I was several pages in when the phone on his desk buzzed. Malcolm pressed the speaker button without looking away from the contract. "Go ahead." The voice of his front desk associate came through, careful and uncertain, carrying the tone people used when they were not sure how the next sentence would be received. "Mr. Bennett, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a woman in the lobby. She says she's your wife." There was a brief pause. "And there's a man with her. He says he's an attorney." The office became very quiet. Tessa did not move. She did not look away from Malcolm, but her posture changed slightly, the way people become still when they understand that something important has just entered the room. Malcolm placed his pen on the desk, slowly. He looked at the federal contract in front of him. His name was printed across the page. The government seal sat above figures that represented everything that Lonely Spare Bedroom had been reaching toward. Then he pressed the speaker button again. "Tell them I'll be down shortly." I did not rush. That was the first thing. Malcolm walked into his private bathroom, turned on the cold water, and placed both hands against the edge of the sink. The marble felt cool beneath his palms. He studied himself in the mirror. There was grey threaded through his close-cut hair now. Fine lines sat at the corners of his eyes. Marks that had not been there years earlier. He saw the face of a man who had earned every single thing waiting upstairs on that desk. Malcolm straightened his deep navy tie. No pattern. Nothing flashy. He smoothed the front of his jacket and watched his own reflection for one more moment. Then he turned off the water and walked out. The elevator opened into the lobby, and Malcolm stepped onto the polished marble floor of a space he knew in exact detail. Dark stone. Pale wood at the reception desk. The company name set into the wall in brushed steel. Malcolm had approved every part of it himself. He had once stood in that exact place and imagined what it might become before the building existed in anything but drawings and hope. He saw Celeste immediately. She stood near the security desk, and she looked almost exactly as he remembered her. Composed, polished, dressed in a charcoal wrap dress that seemed chosen to announce that she belonged in serious rooms. Her hair was pulled back. Her posture was perfect. Celeste had always possessed the practiced ease of a woman who rarely entered a room without first deciding how she wanted everyone inside it to see her. Beside her stood a man Malcolm did not recognize. He appeared to be around 50, wearing a well-fitted grey suit and carrying a dark leather portfolio beneath one arm. His expression was smooth and unhurried, the expression of a man who made a living delivering difficult sentences in pleasant voices. Celeste saw Malcolm approaching. Her face arranged itself into something warm and civil, not a genuine smile, something constructed to resemble one. "Malcolm," she said. She spoke his name the way someone speaks to a person they have already decided how to manage. The man in the grey suit extended his hand. "Harlan Greer, I represent Ms. Harrow." Malcolm shook his hand once and said nothing. Celeste did not wait for the introduction to finish. Patience had never been one of her strengths when she wanted something. "I've been reading about the federal contract," she said. Her voice was calm and reasonable, the same tone she had always used in difficult conversations. The one that made disagreement sound like the unreasonable position. $300 million, Malcolm. That's remarkable. I looked at her. He still said nothing. "I think we both know I'm entitled to my share of what we built together," she continued. "I held that household together for 12 years. My salary paid our bills while you were getting that company started. My benefits covered both of us. I made it possible for you to take risks you couldn't have taken otherwise. She paused and let the words settle. That entitles me to something. My attorney agrees. Greer nodded at exactly the right moment and opened the leather portfolio. We believe the original settlement did not fully account for Ms. Harrow's contribution to the marital estate, he said. We are prepared to establish a basis for reconsideration. He removed a document and placed it on the security desk. Then he slid it toward Malcolm. Malcolm picked it up. He read the first page without expression. His eyes moved slowly down the legal language. Motion to reopen marital asset distribution. Unjust enrichment. Clean, formal words that transformed years of a person's life into a procedural dispute. Malcolm read the page, the way he read every important document, completely, without reacting before he understood every line. Then he placed it back on the security desk. He looked at Celeste for a moment, long enough to see the confidence sitting behind her eyes. She looked like a person who believed she had already won the opening move. Have your office contact Grant Holloway, Malcolm said. You have his number. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator. Hung did not look back. He stepped inside and faced forward as the doors began to close. In the final instant before the polished steel panels met, Malcolm caught a reflection of the lobby behind him. Everything appeared compressed and distorted in the shining metal. Celeste stood where he had left her. The carefully constructed smile was gone. In its place was something smaller and less certain. A recalculation. She had expected anger, or pain, or resistance she could use. Malcolm had given her nothing. The doors closed. He rode 14 floors in silence. When Malcolm returned to his office, Tessa was still sitting where he had left her. She looked at him once with that careful, evaluating gaze of hers and said nothing. Malcolm sat down. He pulled the federal contract back toward him and aligned the pages until every edge was perfectly straight. Get Grant on the phone, he said. Tessa reached for the handset without asking a question. Later, Malcolm drove to Decatur in silence. No music, no radio. Only the hum of the engine and Atlanta stretching around him. I knew the route without needing to think about it. During the worst period after the divorce, he had driven it almost every week, arriving at his sister Rochelle's house with an overnight bag and the particular exhaustion of a man who had been pushing forward for so long that he had forgotten what stopping felt like. Rochelle had never once made him feel like a burden. Malcolm parked behind her silver sport utility vehicle and stayed in the car for a moment, hands resting loosely in his lap. Warm kitchen light glowed through the front window. A shadow crossed it. Rochelle, probably finishing dishes, checking homework, or doing one of the 100 small things that made her house feel like a real home, in a way Malcolm's apartment had not for a long time. I got out and rang the bell. Rochelle answered, wearing a university sweatshirt, reading glasses pushed onto her forehead, and a dish towel hanging over one shoulder. She took one look at his face and stepped aside without asking anything. The house smelled like dinner. Garlic. Something warm from the oven. Her children were already upstairs. The kitchen light was the same soft yellow Malcolm remembered from the hardest months after his marriage ended. He had spent nights on Rochelle's couch with a legal pad balanced against his chest, running numbers that still refused to work, trying to figure out how to keep a company alive when almost every calculation said it should fail. Rochelle poured 2 glasses of sweet tea without asking. She set them on the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat across from him. Malcolm told her everything. The call from the front desk, the lobby, Celeste's charcoal dress and controlled posture, Harlan Greer and the leather portfolio, the legal motion placed on the security desk as though the outcome had already been decided. He repeated what Celeste had said almost word for word. Malcolm remembered details exactly. He always had. Rochelle listened without interrupting. That alone was unusual enough for Malcolm to notice. She held her glass with both hands, watched him carefully, and allowed him to finish the entire story before speaking. When he was done, Rochelle waited a moment. Did Grant keep everything? Every document, Malcolm said. Every date. Everything. Rochelle nodded slowly, the way she did when she was moving a piece into position inside her mind. Malcolm took a long drink of tea and placed the glass on the table. There's something else, he said. Something I never told you. Rochelle waited. At the time of the divorce, Malcolm said, I already had a verbal commitment from PharmCorp, the pharmaceutical distributor. They had told me they were ready to move forward. The relationship was real. He paused, but the contract had not been signed. There were no signatures, no dates. Nothing existed on paper yet. Rochelle kept her eyes on him. Grant had been telling me for months that every important signature needed a clean date. Malcolm continued. He meant it as ordinary legal advice. Good practice. But by then, I had started to suspect something was wrong at home. Malcolm stared at his glass for a moment. A friend of ours told me quietly that Celeste had been spending time with somebody else. Somebody he described as having real money. He repeated the phrase without emotion. I didn't have proof, but I had enough to understand that I needed to protect myself. The kitchen seemed even quieter, so I called PharmCorp and asked them to delay formalizing the contract. I told them there was an internal timing issue. Malcolm looked up at Rochelle. It wasn't really an internal timing issue. I waited until the divorce was filed and finalized. Then I signed. Rochelle did not move. I didn't hide anything, Malcolm said. There was nothing to hide. The contract did not legally exist yet. I just made sure that when it did exist, every date was clean, legal, documented. Grant made certain of that. Rochelle looked at her brother the way she had once looked at students when she was deciding whether their stories held together. But this time it was not skepticism in her face. It was something closer to astonishment. You already knew she was leaving, Rochelle said. I suspected it, Malcolm replied, so I got ready. The refrigerator hummed softly in the corner. Somewhere upstairs, one of Rochelle's children shifted in bed, and a floorboard creaked. The yellow kitchen light held brother and sister inside a small, warm circle. Rochelle studied him for a long moment. The grey at his temples, the steadiness in his eyes, the stillness of a man who had made difficult decisions and lived cleanly with them. Malcolm, she said quietly. You are your grandfather's child. He said nothing. He did not need to. Malcolm picked up his glass, and the two of them sat together in the quiet kitchen while the city night settled around the house. Patient and indifferent, as steady as concrete, and as old as the ground beneath it. The next call from Grant came while Malcolm was sitting at his desk with coffee beside him and a draft contract amendment open in front of him. The skyline beyond the windows was grey beneath heavy clouds. Tessa had already moved in and out of the office more than once, and the day was progressing the way Malcolm liked his days to move, with purpose and without noise. Then his phone lit up. Grant Holloway. Sit down, Grant said before Malcolm could speak. I'm already sitting. Good. Grant paused, using the same silence he always used when arranging his thoughts before delivering something important. I've been doing discovery preparation, he said. Background research. Financial filings. Public records searches. I wanted to understand exactly what we're dealing with before I told you anything. Tell me. Grant did. Preston Vale was the man Celeste had left Malcolm for. The man Malcolm had been told possessed real money. He was a real estate developer with a recognizable name, an expensive condominium, and a public image built around successful projects. But Preston had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection 4 months earlier. It was not gossip. It was a court record filed in the Northern District of Georgia and available to anyone willing to search for it. His real estate company, once valued on paper at close to $40 million, was now worth roughly $800,000 after debt. Months of legal proceedings had made the situation worse. Employees had been laid off. 2 active developments were frozen. Preston's name, once attached to ribbon, cutting ceremonies and glossy investment brochures, had almost disappeared from business coverage. Once someone knew what to look for, the silence told its own story. The luxury condominium Celeste had moved into was in foreclosure. Malcolm remained silent for a moment. He placed his pen on the desk. What does her financial picture look like? He asked. Grant did not soften the answer. Not good. The money she received from the settlement is gone. The house sale gave her a reasonable amount when she moved in with Preston, but that was 3 years ago, and we cannot find much of it left now. Her spousal support ended 18 months ago. She still earns a strong salary as a hospital administrator, but she's carrying expenses that salary was never designed to support. Grant paused. The life she was living cost more than Preston actually had. Another silence. She didn't come back because she suddenly believes in some principle of fairness, Malcolm. She came back because she needs money. The federal contract becoming public gave her a number to chase and an address she knew she could walk into. Malcolm turned toward the windows. A pigeon sat on the ledge of the building across from his office, perfectly still and apparently concerned with nothing at all. What does she actually have? Malcolm asked. Legally, Grant answered with his usual precision. The original waiver is strong. Celeste signed away her interest in the company in clear language, on the record, with her own attorney present. Your timing with the Farm Corp contract gives us clean post-divorce dates on every document that matters. On the question of marital equity in Bennett's supply group, she has almost nothing. Grant paused, but her attorney is not arguing marital equity anymore. Malcolm leaned back slightly. He's smarter than that. Grant continued. He's arguing unjust enrichment. The theory is that Celeste's income, benefits, and financial stability gave you the freedom to take business risks you could not have taken on your own. His argument is that she was the floor you built on. Without her helping to maintain the household, he says, there would have been nothing for the company to grow from. Grant allowed the idea to sit for a moment. It is not a frivolous argument. I need you to understand that. Some judges have found similar arguments compelling. In the right courtroom, with the right presentation and the right optics, this is not automatically an easy win for us. How messy could it become? Malcolm asked. A year, maybe longer. Significant legal fees. Depositions. Discovery. And even if we win, which I believe we ultimately would, it becomes a public story. The contract announcement is already getting attention. Add a dispute with a former spouse, and the story becomes something very different. The pigeon shifted on the ledge and settled again. Malcolm thought about Celeste standing in his lobby with that controlled smile and the slight tilt of her head. He remembered the way she had said $300 million as if she were only reading a number from a page. But that was not what she had really been doing. She had been telling him she had been watching. She had seen how far the business had gone. She had waited until the number became large enough to justify coming back. Malcolm thought about the document she signed 3 years earlier. Her own words. Notarized. I want nothing to do with that business. She had called the company a liability. Malcolm picked up his pen. Then we don't spend a year arguing about it, he said. We end it. Grant was silent for half a second. How? The way I finish everything, Malcolm said. Completely. Soon afterward, Malcolm asked Tessa to retrieve every incorporation document, operating agreement, and financial filing that existed before the divorce. He wanted everything from the earliest days of the company forward. Tessa did not ask why. She simply told him she would organize it. By the end of the workday, a thick manila folder rested on the edge of Malcolm's desk. A small note on the front read, pre-divorce. All of it. Tessa. Malcolm did not open the folder immediately. There was still work to do. And Bennett's supply group did not stop operating simply because his former wife had appeared in the lobby with a lawyer. He answered emails, reviewed a vendor proposal, approved a staffing change in Charlotte. Only after the office had emptied and the city outside began turning amber did Malcolm open the folder. He read for almost an hour. Then he picked up his phone and called Desmond Price. Desmond answered quickly, as he usually did, with the easy manner of someone who saw no reason to pretend he had not been expecting the call. Malcolm. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent enough years in difficult rooms to know that important things rarely improved by being rushed. I heard about the contract, Desmond said. Business section everywhere. Yeah, Malcolm replied. That's part of why I'm calling. There was a short silence. Then Desmond said, she came back. It was not a question. She came back, Malcolm confirmed. Desmond exhaled slowly. Malcolm could picture him sitting in the leather chair inside his home office in Stone Mountain, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, some half-finished drink on the table beside him. Tell me what you need, Desmond said. Malcolm explained the motion, Grant's assessment, Harlan Greer's unjust enrichment argument. Reading the old documents was not teaching Malcolm anything new. It was simply placing dates, numbers, and signatures beside things he had already lived through and never fully forgotten. Desmond filled in what paper could not capture. The first time the company almost died came during its second year. Malcolm had landed a mid-sized pharmaceutical distributor as a client. It was the first account that felt large enough to change the business. But the payment cycle was long, and the gap between what Bennett's supply group was owed and what Malcolm had to spend almost swallowed the company. Needed $40,000 to cover the cash flow difference. Just a bridge, a line of credit. Nothing complicated. The bank was willing to approve it with a co-signer. Malcolm asked Celeste. She said no, not privately, not apologetically. On the record, she spoke directly with the loan officer and stated that she believed the business was not creditworthy and that she was unwilling to attach her name to the loan. The file on Malcolm's desk contained the bank's written notation in plain type. When Celeste refused, Malcolm borrowed the money from Rochelle and Desmond. Rochelle gave him $22,000 from her personal savings. She documented it as a private loan with repayment terms because Rochelle documented everything. Desmond supplied the remaining $18,000. Malcolm paid both of them back in full, including interest he insisted on paying within 14 months. I remember sitting across from you at that diner on Peachtree, Desmond said. You had that bank letter in your hand. I asked what Celeste said, and you looked at me and told me she had concerns. Desmond made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. I knew what that meant. Malcolm said nothing. The second time was worse, Desmond continued. When the Kellner account nearly collapsed, Malcolm remembered every part of it without help. A logistics error involving the wrong routing for a temperature-sensitive shipment almost cost him his largest client at the time. He spent 3 straight weeks working nearly around the clock to repair the damage. Calls deep into the night, revised proposals, site visits. He rebuilt the relationship one conversation at a time while surviving on roughly 4 hours of sleep and whatever coffee remained in the office machine. Celeste went to Savannah during that same crisis. She called it a trip with friends she had already planned. She returned 12 days later with a tan and a complaint that she felt neglected. She wanted Malcolm to take her on a vacation. A real vacation, she said. Somewhere warm. Malcolm did not argue. I went back to work. She didn't put $1 into that company, Desmond said. His voice was calm, not bitter, simply arithmetic. She didn't sign for it. She didn't sit beside it when it was sick. She bet against you, Malcolm. She looked at what you were building and put her money on you failing. He paused. She lost. And now she wants to collect on a ticket she already threw away. Malcolm looked at the bank refusal document. The wording was clean and institutional. Miss Harrow declined to serve as co-signatory, citing concerns regarding the applicant business's creditworthiness. Malcolm called Grant next and told him about the document. Grant wanted the original or a certified copy added to the legal file. He said it in the quiet, certain manner he used whenever he had already decided how the next move should be handled. After ending the call, Malcolm remained alone in the office with the folder open before him. The refusal document, Rochelle's loan receipt, dated and signed, Desmond's repayment record, the Farm Corp contract with its clean post-divorce signature date, and Celeste's own statement from the original divorce deposition, describing Bennett's supply group as financially distressed and not an asset she wanted to be associated with. Malcolm read every page slowly. Each document felt like another wall in a structure becoming more solid by the minute. The revised petition arrived soon afterward. Grant called Malcolm to explain it before the workday became crowded. His voice remained controlled, but Malcolm heard the caution underneath it. Greer's better than I initially gave him credit for, Grant said. He's no longer trying to claim marital equity in the company. He knows the waiver would destroy that argument quickly, so he went around it. Unjust enrichment. Malcolm repeated the phrase. Exactly, Grant said. The argument is that Celeste's salary covered household expenses throughout the marriage. Mortgage, utilities, food, insurance. Her medical benefits covered both of you, including during periods when you did not carry your own coverage. By maintaining that financial stability, Greer argues, she gave you room to take entrepreneurial risks you otherwise could not have taken. His theory is that she did not invest directly in the company. She invested in the conditions that made the company possible. Malcolm remained quiet. "It's a framing argument," Grant continued. "In the narrowest sense, parts of it are technically accurate. She earned income. Bills were paid. He will have records showing that." Grant paused. "I want you to hear me clearly, Malcolm. Arguments like this have persuaded judges before. Not often, but enough that I will not dismiss it as nonsense. Greer knows what he's doing." "I understand," Malcolm said. "The deposition is still moving forward. You'll be there. You will not need to say much." "I know," Malcolm replied. "I just need to be in the room." Grant's conference room sat high above Peachtree Center Avenue. Clean lines, neutral colors, a long mahogany table that looked as though it had witnessed 100 different versions of the same kind of reckoning. Malcolm arrived first. He poured a glass of water, sat on his side of the table, and waited. Celeste entered a few minutes later with Greer beside her. She looked good. That had not changed. She wore a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a style that looked professional without seeming severe. Celeste carried herself with the same composed confidence Malcolm remembered, like someone who had already decided how the room would feel about her and saw no reason to question that decision. Her eyes found Malcolm immediately. He met them without expression. Then he looked down at the notepad in front of him and made a small mark. Nothing important, only the movement of a man settling into work. He did not look up again until the court reporter called everyone to attention. The deposition began. Celeste was polished. She had clearly been coached, but she wore the coaching naturally enough that it became more effective. She described the early years of the marriage in a calm voice that was easy to sympathize with. A hard-working wife who carried the household while supporting a husband's ambitions and asking very little for herself. "I was the financial anchor," she said. "Malcolm had the vision. I had the stable income. I made sure the lights stayed on and the mortgage was paid while he built what he was building. I didn't resent that. I believed in the life we had together." The problem was that none of those individual statements was entirely false. The lights had stayed on. The mortgage had been paid. Celeste had worked. Her income had been real. But Malcolm understood what she was doing. She was describing the walls of a room and calling them the architecture of the entire house. Malcolm sat across from her and said almost nothing. He answered procedural questions when they were directed at him. He did not interrupt. He did not shift restlessly in his chair. He listened the way someone listens to an explanation they have already examined from every side. For most of the deposition, Celeste avoided looking directly at him. She focused on Greer, Grant, and the court reporter's hands. Her performance remained smooth. Then, deep into the questioning, Celeste made another point about household insurance and briefly looked across the table, perhaps checking whether her story was landing the way she intended. She found Malcolm watching her, not angry, not contemptuous, not wounded, simply watching, completely still, like a man sitting in a room where he already knew what every important sentence would be before anyone said it. Celeste's next sentence came out slightly slower. Only a fraction, almost too small to notice. Her eyes moved away from Malcolm and back toward Grant. She recovered smoothly, but the fact that she needed to recover told Malcolm everything. She had expected some reaction from him, some sign that her words were reaching him. There was nothing there for her to use. The deposition ended after roughly 90 minutes. Celeste and Greer gathered their materials and left with the measured courtesy of people who believed they had performed well. When the door closed behind them, Grant stacked his notes and looked across the table at Malcolm. "You ready to show them what we have?" Malcolm capped his pen. "Not yet," he said. "Let her feel safe a little longer." Grant gave one slow nod. It was the nod of a lawyer who understood the difference between a client reacting emotionally and a client positioning carefully. He gathered his notes and said nothing else. Later, Grant called Rochelle personally. Malcolm had asked him to make the call himself, not because Rochelle required legal formality, but because Grant had a way of speaking that made people understand something mattered without needing to dramatize it. Rochelle answered quickly. "Mrs. Bennett Cross," Grant said. "I'm calling at your brother's request. I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to take your time before answering." "Go ahead," Rochelle said. "During the period leading up to Malcolm's divorce, did you keep any documentation of conversations you had with Celeste? Written messages, electronic records, recordings, anything that captured her exact words?" Rochelle was silent for a moment. "What kind of documentation?" "Any kind," Grant replied. "Text messages, emails, voice recordings, anything that preserved what she actually said." Another silence followed, longer this time. "Let me check something," Rochelle said. "I'll call you back." Rochelle opened the voice memo folder on her phone. She approached it the way she approached most things, efficiently and without drama. The folder contained years of recordings, most labeled with brief descriptions in her own shorthand. Parent conferences, disciplinary meetings, family names, short reminders that would mean nothing to anyone except her. The habit had developed during her years as a vice principal after one difficult meeting in which a parent later disputed what Rochelle had said, and she had no record to support herself. After that experience, she did not record every conversation. She recorded the ones that became adversarial, the moments when she felt the ground beneath a discussion change, and experience told her the shift might matter later. She scrolled through older files, moving back past recent years and into recordings made before Malcolm's divorce. She almost missed it. The label was simple: Celeste call. Rochelle pressed play and raised the phone to her ear. Her own voice came first, cautious and measured. The tone she used whenever she already knew a conversation might become important. "I think that man is going to be extraordinary." Then Celeste's voice came through the speaker, smooth and unhurried, carrying the patience of someone who had already made up her mind. "I hope you're right, Rochelle. I really do. But I can't afford to bet my life on hope." Rochelle stood motionless in her kitchen. Then she called Grant back. She brought the phone to his office before work the next morning. Grant had a technician copy the audio, verify the metadata, and prepare a written transcript. The file was authenticated, and soon a certified copy of the transcript sat in a manila folder on his desk. Grant called Malcolm. Malcolm came to the office and sat across from him. He read the transcript once. It was less than half a page. Still, he read every line slowly, the way he read contracts, giving each sentence his full attention before moving to the next. When he finished, Malcolm placed the paper back on Grant's desk. He remained quiet for a long moment. His hands rested flat on the table. "I was not clenching them." Grant did not rush to fill the silence. Outside the window, Atlanta moved through the evening. Headlights appeared below. Traffic hummed along Peachtree. The sky slowly dimmed between the buildings. Malcolm looked at this transcript once more without touching it. "Add it to the file," he said. Grant nodded. I did exactly that. Soon afterward, Malcolm was reviewing logistics projections with Tessa when the front desk called upstairs. "Mr. Bennett, there's a man in the lobby asking to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. He says his name is Preston Vale." Tessa looked up from her laptop. Her expression remained neutral, but the question was clear in her eyes. Malcolm considered it briefly. "Tell him I'll be down." Preston stood near the building's front windows when Malcolm stepped from the elevator. He wore a dark suit that had clearly been expensive once. The quality remained visible in the fabric and cut, but it hung differently on him now, as if he had lost weight he never intended to lose. His posture was upright, but there was effort behind it. The way people stand when maintaining composure has become work. Preston extended his hand as Malcolm approached. Malcolm shook it. "Appreciate you coming down," Preston said. "Follow me," Malcolm replied. Hay led Preston to a small conference room off the main hallway, not his office. The small room, 4 chairs, a narrow table, no skyline view. Malcolm closed the door and sat across from him. Preston began with a polished business proposal. There was a development project that needed logistics support, regional supply chain work. Preston had been following Bennett Supply Group's growth and thought there might be a natural alignment between their companies. Perhaps, he suggested, The legal situation could be resolved more amicably if everyone found a way to work together. "Preston," Malcolm said. His voice was quiet and level. "Why are you here?" Preston stopped. Malcolm continued. "Not what you're saying. Why are you actually here?" The room went still. Preston looked down at the table for a moment. When he raised his eyes again, the business pitch had disappeared from his face. What remained was smaller and more honest. "She's going to lose, isn't she?" he said. It was not really a question. "Yes," Malcolm replied. Preston nodded slowly. "And then she'll understand that she spent everything." He sounded like a man repeating a sentence he had already tried and failed to rewrite in his own mind. "And she'll look at me and realize what happened. That's between you and her," Malcolm said. He stood and buttoned his jacket. Then he opened the conference room door. Preston remained seated for a moment. Finally, he stood, picked up his portfolio, and walked toward the lobby without another word. Malcolm went directly to Tessa's desk. "Document that visit," he said. "Who he is." Tessa was already reaching for her keyboard. Later, after the building had gone quiet and almost everyone had gone home, Malcolm remained in his office. The cleaning crew had finished. The front desk was locked. Tessa had stopped at his doorway before leaving, coat on and bag over her shoulder. "Go home at a reasonable hour," she told him in the same tone she always used. Not quite a request and not quite an order. Malcolm nodded. Tessa did not believe him. She was right not to. Malcolm remained behind his desk long after the floor had emptied. The city stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking almost like an image from a life he never would have allowed himself to imagine when that kind of future belonged to other people. Grant's binder was open in front of him. It was thorough, the kind of document that made loud arguments unnecessary. It simply presented the truth in sequence and allowed the sequence to do the work. Tab by tab, the bank refusal, Rochelle's loan receipts, Desmond's signed and notarized affidavit, the Farm Corp anchor contract with its clean post-divorce date, Celeste's own words from the original divorce deposition printed plainly on white paper, and at the back, protected inside a clear sleeve, the certified transcript of a telephone conversation Celeste had once had with a woman she assumed would never preserve it. Malcolm read through everything slowly, not because he needed to learn it. He knew every page. He read it the way a person revisits something important to make sure it is still real. His thoughts returned to the spare bedroom. Not this headquarters, not these windows. A spare bedroom inside a rented house in East Point with a second-hand desk pushed against the wall and a cheap lamp. Malcolm bought at a garage sale for $4 because the overhead light buzzed loudly enough to break his concentration. A used laptop, a printed list of cold call numbers, each number marked by hand after he dialed it, a dot for no answer, a line through the name for a firm rejection, a small star for someone who asked him to call again. Malcolm had made those calls late at night because late at night was the only time he owned. The rest belonged to the day job, the commute, household responsibilities, and the careful management of a life that needed two incomes to remain balanced. He would come home, eat whatever was available in the refrigerator, sit at that second-hand desk, and begin dialing. Celeste was usually asleep down the hall. Sometimes she was awake. Malcolm could not remember a single time she walked into that room and asked him how it was going. He did not think about that with bitterness anymore. It was simply a fact, like the date printed on a contract. Either something happened or it did not. His mind moved to the kitchen table from their marriage. Malcolm had refinished it himself during the second year they were together. He stripped it to bare wood, stained it dark walnut, and sealed it carefully until it looked like something from a showroom. He had been proud of it in the uncomplicated way a person feels proud of something made with their own hands. Celeste approved of the result. Back then, that approval had felt like enough. That was the table where she later slid the divorce papers toward him. Malcolm remembered the morning clearly. Light through the kitchen window. Coffee he never touched. Celeste sitting across from him with straight posture and perfect composure. She did not look like someone struggling through a decision. She looked like someone who had already completed the decision before entering the room. The papers were prepared. Her lawyer had already been retained. There were no screaming voices, because there was nothing left to argue about. Celeste had already left emotionally. The conversation was administrative. She did not want the company. She had said so plainly. She had written it down and placed her signature beneath the words. Malcolm let her go. Then he returned to the work. A different room, a different desk, but the same discipline, the same willingness to keep moving when nobody was promising an ending worth reaching. Sitting in his office with the binder open before him, Malcolm did not feel rage. Rage was too hot for him now. Too quick, too imprecise. Rage belonged to people who had been blindsided. Malcolm had not been blindsided. He had been prepared. There was a difference, and that difference had changed everything. What he felt was quieter and more complete. It was the feeling of a man who had done the work, kept the records, and waited for facts to become useful. Not impatiently, not with clenched fists, simply with the steady knowledge that the truth had been documented and that, when tested, the documents would hold. Malcolm closed the binder. He picked up the phone and called Grant. Grant answered immediately. "You still at the office?" he asked. "Yes," Malcolm said. "I want to confirm the conference before the hearing." "It's confirmed," Grant replied. "Greer will be there. Celeste will be there." He paused. "Avery is still coming?" "Yes." Grant hesitated. "You're sure about bringing her sister into this?" "She needs one person in that room," Malcolm said, "who will tell her the truth." Grant was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." Malcolm ended the call. He looked once more at the binder, closed it, and aligned it neatly against the edge of the desk. Then he switched off the office lights and rode the elevator down 14 floors. He drove home through Atlanta without anxiety and without anger. I was simply ready. Grant's conference room was located several blocks from the courthouse. It was a serious room, built for decisions rather than comfort. A dark wood table, 8 chairs, a credenza against one wall with water and glasses people rarely touched. Framed degrees hung on the wall, not as decoration, but as evidence of the man who had earned them. Malcolm arrived first. He placed 2 identical binders on the table, one where Greer was expected to sit, and one where Celeste would sit. Then he took his chair across from both positions. Grant entered a short while later, carrying his briefcase and coffee. He checked the recorder, made sure everything was working, and set it aside without comment. Greer arrived next. He looked polished and professional, leather portfolio under one arm, carrying the practiced ease of a man who had handled difficult meetings many times before. His eyes moved toward the binders. He said nothing, but Malcolm noticed that Greer's gaze remained on them slightly longer than casual curiosity required. Celeste came in behind him, charcoal blazer, hair pulled back. The same controlled readiness she had worn in Malcolm's lobby and during the deposition. Celeste had always been good at entering rooms. Then she saw Avery Harrow, seated quietly near the window. For the first time, her composure slipped before she could stop it. "Avery." Her voice became careful. "What are you doing here?" Avery met her sister's eyes. "Malcolm called me," she said. "I came." Celeste looked toward Malcolm. I was already seated with his hands folded in front of him, watching her with the same still expression he had worn during the deposition. He did not look like a man preparing to argue. He looked like a man who had already finished the argument before anyone else entered the room. "Sit down," Malcolm said. There was no cruelty in his voice, only certainty. Celeste sat. Malcolm began without ceremony. "I'm not here to negotiate," he said. "I'm here to show you what exists. After that, you're going to make a decision." He gave Grant a small nod. Grant pushed one binder toward Greer. "Tab 1, Malcolm said. The bank refusal. 2 pages on official letterhead. Celeste's name printed clearly in the section explaining that the co-signer had declined to participate. Her signature appeared beneath the refusal. Greer opened the binder. His expression remained professional, but his eyes moved carefully over every line. "Tab 2, Malcolm continued. Rochelle's loan receipt. Personal funds. Documented as a private loan. Repayment records attached. The money that kept Bennett's Supply Group alive, when the bank would not release the credit without a co-signer, had come from Malcolm's sister's personal savings, not from a joint marital account, not from money Celeste invested, not from anything she offered to place at risk. Tab 3, Desmond Price's affidavit. 3 pages. Plain language. Specific amounts. Specific events. Desmond had been there when the company nearly failed. I had loaned Malcolm money. I had watched Malcolm struggle to keep the business alive. The affidavit did not insult Celeste or speculate about motives. It simply explained what happened. What happened was enough. Greer turned the page and read more slowly now. The relaxed confidence in his posture had begun to settle into something quieter. Tab 4, Malcolm said. The anchor contract. At the bottom of the signature page was the date. The agreement had been signed 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, not during the marriage, not during a period when Celeste held any ownership interest in the business. Afterward, clean, documented, unambiguous. Celeste still had not opened her binder. She was watching Malcolm instead. Tab 5, he said. Now she opened it. Malcolm watched her eyes find the document, her own words from her own deposition during the original divorce proceeding. Financially distressed and not an asset I want to be associated with. Her signature appeared beneath the acknowledgement. She had said it under oath. At the time, she had believed every word. She had simply been wrong about what the company would become. And now that error sat in front of her, inside a clear plastic sleeve. The room became very quiet. Grant stood and walked to the credenza. He picked up the recorder, brought it to the table, and pressed play without explaining what everyone was about to hear. The recording was clear. Rochelle's voice came first. I think that man is going to be extraordinary. Then Celeste's voice filled the room. I hope you're right, Rochelle. I really do. But I can't afford to bet my life on hope. Grant stopped the recording. No one spoke. Greer looked at his client. The expression on his face was no longer the expression of a lawyer reconsidering how to present an argument. It was the expression of a lawyer beginning to understand that the argument itself had become extremely difficult to sustain. Celeste sat perfectly still. Malcolm closed his binder. I built this without you, he said. His voice remained even. No anger, no performance. You made sure of that when you walked away. You refused to sign. You refused to invest. You said what you said to my sister, and you said what you said under oath. You put your own name beneath all of it. Malcolm allowed one breath of silence. You are not entitled to what I built after you chose to leave it behind. He looked directly across the table. Withdraw the motion, and this ends here. You walk out of this room, and we never have to speak again. He paused. If you continue, every document in this binder can become part of the public record. Every word, every date, every signature. Malcolm turned toward Avery. I called you because she deserves one person in this room who will actually be honest with her. Avery had remained quiet through the entire presentation. Now she turned towards her sister. The two women looked at each other. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with lawyers, motions, contracts, or money. It was older than the dispute. It belonged only to sisters. Celeste, Avery said softly. Let it go. Celeste did not answer immediately. But something behind her eyes changed. The careful calculation she had carried into the room weakened. It was almost like watching a structure finally acknowledge the weight it could no longer support. For the first time since she entered Malcolm's lobby, beside an attorney with a leather portfolio and a smile that never reached her eyes, Celeste looked like someone who understood that the outcome had already moved beyond her control. The matter went before Judge Annette Pruitt in a quiet courtroom. There was no excess ceremony, no grand speech. Judge Pruitt had spent 19 years on the bench, and the efficiency of her manner made it clear how little patience she had for wasted time. Malcolm sat beside Grant at the respondents' table. Celeste and Greer sat across the aisle. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, and lit with ordinary fluorescent lights. Nothing about it looked cinematic. It simply looked official. When Greer was called, he stood and stated clearly for the record that his client was voluntarily withdrawing the motion. Judge Pruitt looked over her glasses at him. Then she looked directly at Celeste. Ms. Harrow, she said, using the maiden name listed in the filing. You understand that this withdrawal is with prejudice. That means you cannot bring this same claim again. Not next month. Not next year. Not ever. She gave the words enough time to settle. Do you understand? Celeste sat upright. Her voice remained controlled. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Pruitt held her gaze briefly. Then she lowered her eyes to the paperwork, made a notation, and spoke without looking up. Motion withdrawn with prejudice. Matter closed. She turned the page. That was all. 19 years on the bench had shown Judge Prewitt countless versions of people trying to reopen choices after circumstances changed. She did not lecture anyone. She did not offer moral commentary. She simply moved to the next case. In the hallway, Grant shook Malcolm's hand. It was firm and meaningful. The kind of handshake that carried weight from a man who rarely offered gestures without purpose. Grant allowed himself one small nod, the closest he came to visible satisfaction. Then he opened his briefcase and put the file away. I'll send the final billing when everything is processed, he said. Thank you, Grant, Malcolm replied. For all of it. Grant nodded. Don't let anyone else make you come back here. Malcolm almost smiled. I won't. He walked out of the courthouse and into the Atlanta morning. The air was warm. Traffic moved steadily along the street. Somewhere nearby, a delivery truck waited at a light with its engine idling, steady and unhurried. Malcolm did not turn around toward the courthouse doors. He did not wait to see Celeste come outside. There was nothing left he needed to witness. He went back to work. A few weeks later, a regional business publication ran a short article about the case. Bennett Supply Group founder defeats post-divorce equity claim. The piece was brief. It relied on the public court record, mentioned the post-divorce contract date, and noted that the motion had been dismissed with prejudice. It did not mention the private recording. It did not need to. The article moved through Atlanta business circles quietly, the way small stories often move, person to person and office to office. People who knew Malcolm read it and were not surprised. People who did not know him read it and remembered his name. Celeste's name did not appear in the article. It did not have to. The professional world she worked in was not particularly large, and the story eventually found its way there, without Malcolm doing anything to help it travel. A couple of months later, Celeste was passed over for a department chief position she had been working toward for 2 years. No explanation was given. None was necessary. The opportunity simply closed without ceremony, the way consequences sometimes arrive. Preston's bankruptcy was finalized later that year. The luxury condominium was surrendered. Preston and Celeste moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Atlanta, a perfectly respectable place that looked nothing like the future Celeste had imagined for herself at 42. Malcolm did not monitor any of it. He learned about those developments, the way a person hears about weather moving through a city they no longer live in. Incidentally, without searching for it. 2 years passed. The federal contract renewed early because Bennett Supply Group's performance exceeded expectations. The company still employed 340 people across Atlanta, Charlotte, and Houston. The Charlotte operation had been open for 14 months. Houston had been running for 8. Both offices were profitable. Malcolm's attention remained where it had always been when life became complicated, on the work in front of him. But success changed the scale of what he was able to do for the people who had stood beside him when there was nothing impressive to stand beside. Malcolm created a position inside the company's facilities management division for his father. He called him one evening from the parking garage after a late meeting because he did not want to make the offer in an email and did not want to postpone it until another day. His father listened while Malcolm explained the role. Then there was silence. Malcolm knew what the silence meant. His father was crying, quietly, in the particular way men of his generation sometimes cried, where the emotion appeared less in sound than in a changed rhythm of breathing. Malcolm looked at this concrete wall in front of his car and waited. Nothing he could say would improve that silence. The title was Director of Facilities Legacy. Malcolm had written the title himself. I had thought about it for 3 weeks before allowing himself to put the words on paper. It meant more than a job. His father had spent 30 years installing heating and cooling systems inside buildings owned by other people. He had come home tired, hands rough, clothes carrying the smell of work, and had done it all without believing anyone owed him applause. Now he would walk into a company bearing his son's name and help oversee the buildings that company depended on. Rochelle learned about the appointment soon afterward, the way Rochelle seemed to learn about most important family developments, slightly ahead of schedule and without anyone formally telling her. At a family dinner, she announced the news before their father had managed to mention it himself. I pretended to be annoyed. Nobody believed him. Rochelle and Malcolm also developed a standing lunch every other week. Malcolm tried to cancel twice because work became crowded. Both times, Rochelle called him back almost immediately and told him no. Eventually, he stopped trying to cancel. There was comfort in knowing at least one appointment in his life could not be moved by a contract, a client, or a crisis. Desmond Price had also remained in Malcolm's mind. Desmond had signed an affidavit when placing his name on an affidavit truly mattered. Arnie had given Malcolm money when the company was close to failing, and when the safer choice would have been to keep his distance. So when a mid-sized Atlanta manufacturer later asked Malcolm if he knew a strong business consultant, Malcolm made one call. He recommended Desmond. The manufacturer hired him. Within a year, the account had tripled the revenue of Desmond's own consulting firm. Malcolm never framed it as repayment. He simply remembered who had shown up when showing up carried a cost. That was not the kind of thing he forgot. Avery called once, not to update Malcolm about Celeste, not to apologize for her sister, not to explain anything that had already been explained well enough by documents and choices. It was only a short, warm call. "I hope you're doing well, Malcolm," she said. "I am," he replied. And he meant it. Eventually, Malcolm met Simone Archer. Simone was a landscape architect with her own firm, her own convictions, and absolutely no interest in the mythology that had started forming around Malcolm's name in certain Atlanta business circles. They met at a fundraiser for a local youth program, an event neither of them had expected to find particularly interesting. Within the first 20 minutes of speaking to him, Simone was arguing that the city was not doing enough to protect its old growth tree canopy. She did not care that Malcolm ran a fast-growing company. She cared whether his opinion about urban development made sense. Malcolm found himself thinking about her for 3 days afterward. Simone never asked for the detailed story of his divorce. She knew the broad outline. He had been married. The marriage ended badly. There had been a difficult legal dispute years later. That was enough for her. She was interested in Malcolm, not in the story people could tell about him. The actual man, what he ate for breakfast, why he still kept a legal pad beside his bed when he owned enough technology to eliminate paper from his life completely. Whether he believed a proposed highway expansion would damage West Side neighborhoods as badly as some residents feared. What kind of trees he preferred near a house. Why he checked important documents twice even when people he trusted had already reviewed them. She wanted to know the small things that did not appear in business articles. Malcolm slowly began to understand that this was what connection was supposed to feel like. Not being evaluated for what he might become. Not being tolerated while someone waited to see whether a risk would pay off. Not being admired because the building had his name on it. Simply being known. One evening, Malcolm and Simone sat together on the back porch of the house he now owned outright. It was a comfortable house with a real yard, mature oak trees, and a porch wide enough to use rather than simply admire from the street. The sky shifted from orange toward purple above the tree line. Simone had a glass of wine in her hand. Malcolm had been quiet for several minutes, staring at nothing in particular, in the way he sometimes did when his mind wandered backward before returning to the present. Simone watched him for a moment. "What do you think about when you get quiet like that?" she asked. Malcolm considered the question. I gave it the same honest attention he gave anything worth answering. "The spare bedroom," he said. Simone waited, where I started. "I think about how small that room was." He paused. "And how none of it mattered in the end." Simone nodded slowly. She did not ask him to explain. She understood enough. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not even most of it, but enough to know that Malcolm had answered the question fully. Enough to understand that the man sitting beside her had traveled an enormous distance to become this calm. The sky grew darker. The oak trees became dark outlines against it. Malcolm did not think about Celeste often anymore. Entire weeks passed without her crossing his mind. But every now and then, something would bring back one particular document. It might happen while Malcolm sat in a first-class seat on a flight to Washington, or while he watched someone sign the final page of a contract containing more zeros than the young man in that mustard-carpeted spare bedroom would ever have allowed himself to imagine. Then Malcolm would remember a page from the divorce. A page Celeste had signed herself, her words, her decision, her own free will. "I want nothing to do with that business." Malcolm had done exactly what she asked. I had taken the business with him. I had taken the risk with him. He had taken the debt. the uncertainty, the late nights, the rejected calls, the failing accounts, and every responsibility that came with keeping a fragile company alive. And when the business eventually became something valuable, he had also accepted what came with that. The employees, the contracts, the pressure, the obligation to keep building carefully, because hundreds of families now depended on decisions made inside offices carrying his name. The most important lesson in Malcolm's story was never that success is the best revenge. He did not build Bennett Supply Group to punish Celeste. He did not spend years waiting for the day he could humiliate her. His life became stronger because he kept doing the work that was in front of him, even when nobody was promising that the work would lead anywhere. And when the past returned, asking him to reopen a decision that had already been made, Malcolm did not answer with cruelty. He answered with preparation. There is something worth remembering in that. We cannot always control who believes in us. We cannot force someone to stay when they have decided to leave. We cannot make people recognize the value of something before they are ready to see it. But we can choose how carefully we live. We can keep our word. We can document important decisions. We can take responsibility for our own choices. And when disappointment comes, we can decide whether it turns us bitter or makes us wiser. Celeste had choices too. Years earlier, she chose not to risk her financial security on a company she believed would fail. She was allowed to make that choice. What she could not do was erase it simply because the outcome later became more valuable than she expected. Responsibility means accepting not only the choices that work in our favor, but also the choices we wish we had made differently. Forgiveness does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes forgiveness simply means refusing to carry anger into every room you enter afterward. Malcolm did not invite Celeste back into his life. He did not pretend nothing had happened. He set a boundary, allowed the legal matter to end, and kept moving. That gave him space for things resentment might have crowded out. A deeper relationship with Rochelle, a meaningful opportunity for his father, a chance to repay Desmond's loyalty in a way that strengthened another man's future, and eventually a relationship with Simone built on curiosity, respect, and the freedom to be known without being measured against a possible payoff. Real strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting quietly in a conference room while documents tell the truth for him. Sometimes it looks like a father trying not to cry on the phone when his son offers him a place in something the family never imagined possible. Sometimes it looks like remembering who helped when help was inconvenient. And sometimes it is simply the ability to sit on your own porch beside someone who sees you clearly and realize that the hardest chapter of your life no longer controls the story. Malcolm had once believed the smallest room in his life was where he had been trapped. Years later, he understood that it was where he learned how to build. I hope you enjoyed that story. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I've picked out 2 more stories for you that I think you'll really enjoy.